back as Sean Maurer for the Love and Division channel, and we are continuing with our book review, Warwolves of the Iron Cross, Hyenas of High Finance, translated by Fred Sherbaum. And basically it's the writings of Dr. Heinrich Pudor from the 1930s in Germany, in the early 40s. And so we're finding sort of like, we're getting some first-hand information about what was really going on with the National Socialists, as opposed to the crazy, bizarre stuff that we're taught in school and in our culture today. Like, the way it was presented, the way Nazi Germany was presented to me growing up was like, this guy named Adolf Hitler, he woke up one day and decided, what am I going to do today? I know, I guess I'll kill the Jews. You know what I mean? It's like, that's how deep it was. Oh my gosh. All right, so let me finish reading where I left off. All right. Following the dissolution of the lodges in Germany, the Masonic organizations forming Austria were earmarked for elimination in the national territory of the former Czechoslovakia. The lodges dissolved themselves on the grounds of caution. In former Poland, they were compelled to yield before the strength of the anti-Masonic forces. In Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, the lodges were dissolved only after the occupation of German troops. In France, the government recognized in Freemasonry one of the parties jointly guilty for the defeat of France and prohibited Masonic activity. Masonic personal influence was also eliminated by corresponding laws. The events of the war in southeastern Europe have paralyzed the activities of Freemasonry in major areas, so that Masonry is now respected in only a few European countries. Apart from Denmark and Sweden, it works chiefly out of Switzerland. Outside the European continent, Freemasonry still enjoys a position of unchallenged power, as in Great Britain and particularly North America, where it has been decisive in steering political opinion against National Socialism, New European Order. In their last bastions, Freemasons work together with their other enemies of National Socialism, with world Jewry and political churches and international Marxism. All German folk comrades must recognize the dangers of the liberalistic Masonic body of thought. Any attempt to reintroduce Masonic thoughts and symbolism in whatever form or appearance, even again in German literature and German art and science or political concepts, must be nipped in the bud. We learn from history that Freemasonry has been forbidden many times and in many different states, yet it fell upon the people again and again in times of crisis. Like the poison of corruption, this text is intended to contribute towards protecting the German people from such a fate. All right. Now, we shall read, 116.2. I've only got an hour per thing now. Okay, so I gotta go. What is important to understand then is that Hitler felt that race mixing was tantamount to genocide. He observed that people of color stood alone in the world as distinctive races, so why shouldn't those not of color do the same? This important point is that is not racist but supportive of genuine diversity. Communism and modern leftism are anti-diversity movements that parade as pro-diversity. Both are in fact white people's movements. In contrast, National Socialism was not racist. It was folkish, which is more cultural and nationalistic than racial. Folkists, if we may use such a term, believe that each unique body of people, that is the Volk, made up each unique nation in the world, was integral to that particular nation's political system, national character, national culture, national traits, national identity, national behavior, etc. But that each Volk was oftentimes multiracial itself. Thus, less emphasis is on biology per se than one might assume. Dr. Pudor was a racist in the sense of how the term is used today. Back then, his views were considered the norm. though, as we see, he tended to be a bit more extreme in his views of Jews than were most of the National Socialist contemporaries. His more extreme ideas never did acquire a mainstream following in National Social Germany, but they certainly helped stir debate. Furthermore, Dr. Pudor explained the connection between Judaism, international banking, Russian communism, French and English Freemasonry, connection that few others were willing or able to make in such a brief and deliberate approach. And I kind of, I personally, I fall in this category. The idea that, my ideal nation would be a Christian theocracy, but that would just be for people like myself who would voluntarily be part of it. It's not a model for everybody, obviously. There's going to be other models for other. That the problem we're having now is that people have an idea of what they would like to see for world politic and for their own government, and they want to apply it to the whole world. And there's a very thin line between having a universal, favored, governance and enforcing it, wanting to see it be enforced. Right now, that's what we're living in. Is there's this globalist, humanist faction that owns the globe pretty much, and they want to enforce the humanistic religion globally. And so, the way they, supposedly value freedom of religion is not really because religions speak to the government. You're not allowed to. Why am I paying taxes as a Christian if I've been denied a voice in the lawmaking process? See, it's a scam. And so Christians should really secede and start their own nations and, let other people secede and start other nations that are not necessarily Christian. I don't care. You don't have to be a Christian unless you're going to... See, my idea is if you had such a thing as a Christian nation, people who want to come into it would come into with the understanding they're coming into a Christian nation, and they have no right to try to influence or change it. And that's really what Hitler was trying to do. By the time we get to the end of this book, you'll see that the guy had very noble objectives. And like General Patton says, it's too bad that we fought on the wrong side of that war. Okay, so let us continue now. 127, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. The Russians separated the civilian from the POWs and trucked us to the nearest train back to Iglau. Okay, this is I don't know, I'm not reading the very first part of this page. Okay, give you an idea of what I'm reading about. Okay. When the war ended, my oldest sister Eva was already at university in Prague. When we saw the German soldiers returning from the Russian front, my mother Friedel and I stood in front of the house with our suitcases and were picked up by the retreating German soldiers. They took us to a POW camp near Pilsen, where the Americans were in camp. We assembled in a large field and camped there for a week or so. I translated for the GIs until the time Americans left and the dreaded Russians took over. Now, some of the Germans that surrendered, a lot of them, millions of the Germans surrendered to the Americans, were actually starved to death in, what you call it, a real death camp, Okay, but the Russians were the worst, though. You were talking about an army of Jeffrey Epstein's and Weinberg's, of young, armed. That's really what it was, really, with permission and encouragement to rape and kill as many people as they could possibly get in a day's work. The Russians separated the civilian POWs and trucked us to the nearest train back to Iglau, which was now occupied by the Russians. A colonel thankfully requisitioned us a room in our house, and this shielded us from the worst of what happened in our town in the next few days. The Russians raped the women and the girls and made the fathers and the brothers watch. They ordered us on penalty of death to turn in all of our fur coats the first day. The next day it was all of our jewelry, and then we had to turn in all our musical instruments. Frieda was on her way to turn in her accordion when she saw a Russian soldier and gave it to him instead. Okay, now this is interesting because this is what the American Marxists want for America. They want to see this happen someday. This is what they want. They want to see like a complete rape and pillage of anybody who's a conservative or Christian or believes that white people have a right to live. There's a large constituency in America today that are pushing for this kind of thing to happen. One day the a stamp dealer came to our house. And I brought lots of stamps from him over the years. He had his pistol drawn and demanded to see my stamp collection. When I showed it to him, he hit me over the head with his pistol and took my prized collection. There was nothing I could do. I was lucky that he didn't shoot me. We were soon forced to leave our home with only 20 minutes' notice and moved in with some relatives. We were all crowded into an attic room with mattresses on the floor. Mother had some photographs with her, and she brought them to a Czech friend who lived nearby. The woman kept them for her until the war was over. There was constant shooting during the nights. During the first month of occupation by the Russians, over 10% of the population of Iglau committed suicide because of the atrocities committed against them. Over the next year, 241,000 Sudeten Germans were killed. It is estimated that $19.44 billion at the 1945 exchange rate of property was stolen from them during the same year. We had salami hanging from a nail on the doorframe of the pantry through the whole war. It kept getting harder and greener the whole time. After a while, it became a symbol to us that we still had something to eat. When we were given 20 minutes to leave, it was one of the items left behind in the rush. Many times during the next year, we thought of that salami. Let me see, I'm going to keep reading. This is kind of an interesting story, right? Okay. Page 129, 2 to 7. Several families shared each room in the barracks in the concentration camp. A family in our room had a very pretty daughter. One day a Russian officer saw her as he came through the barracks. He said to her, "Tonight I am going to come for you." That night when he came for her, she was dead in her bed. She had committed suicide rather than submit to the atrocities she knew awaited her. One day the Russians took all of us young people to move a large herd of military horses to Pilsen. Each one of us was in charge of 4 horses tied together. I wore only some light shoes and my lederhosen. The skin on my butt was worn off by the time I got back. Russian trucks and cars used the roads, so we went cross-country. I once slipped off my horse, and the horse stepped on my foot, just missing my toes. The only food we got was a small bowl of potato soup in the evening. Then we slept in the open with no bedding of any kind. One day I drifted to the rear of the column of horses and found Cossacks with long whips hitting the horses to speed them back up. I saw an old man fall off and getting tangled in the rigging. They laughed and whipped the horses to full gallop, dragging the man to his death. I made my way back to the front of the pack and decided no matter what I wouldn't drift to the rear again. When we arrived in Pilsen, we were told to take the horses back. They didn't need or want them. So we made the same trip in reverse. The whole episode took about 3 weeks. After 2 months, Friedel and I were sent to a camp near Stannern, where they used us as slave labor. Here again, we were in camp designed for a few hundred, but thousands of us were cramped in. They again took all the young people to work on Czech's farms. This wasn't quite so bad because the farmers appreciated us and we had some food to eat with families. After the harvest was over, they sent us back to camp. Again, all of us had no communication with our parents. They didn't know where we were. Okay, that was 129. The camp was so crowded at night, the entire courtyard was filled with sleeping bodies. People, body against body. We were lucky it wasn't raining while we were there. because then the courtyard was a mud pond and people had to sleep in the dirt and the filth. Every night the Russians came with flashlights and pricked out the pretty girls. One night a Russian came so close to us I could have touched his boots. He shined the flashlights around and I covered my sister, Friedel, so he couldn't see her. At night we heard screams and the girls were never seen again. The young women tried to make themselves unattractive by smearing dirt on their faces, but it didn't always work. Okay. 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 Let's see here. 133 at the... Okay. Okay, so somebody gave him a military suit, a suit of military clothing, and somebody saw, and they called him before a military judge, and he said, "It's true, I have an army uniform. The American GIs gave them to me for cleaning the rooms." Then I went ahead and gave the judge a history lesson. Americans signed the Postum Agreement, and because of that I became homeless. Now I'm just trying to get my life back together again. He understood the history lesson and released me. So, because he was supposed to get in trouble for having that uniform. But, all right, let's see what else. 164 too. Okay, we're moving along now. We might get this done in one more session. Let me see. 164. Okay. By 1944, thousands of concentration camps and lager camps dotted the German landscape. Incidentally, these camps proved safer than either the cities or the production facilities not located in or near concentration camps. Consider Dresden. An estimated 200,000 Germans, POWs, and refugees of many nationalities perished in that air raid. No such air raid was ever conducted against concentration camp or the OT camp. According to Bernard Lewis, Jewish organizations in London and Washington repeatedly urged the Allied governments to bomb Auschwitz. Evidently, Jewish leaders in the Allied nations did not care that there were Jews in Auschwitz. The Grand Mufti, on the other hand, urged Berlin to bomb Tel Aviv. No Allied government obliged, Lewis wrote, that neither request served any military purpose, so both were declined. However, Hitler's refusal to bomb Tel Aviv contradicts what historians usually say about him. According to the United Nations Special Committee report on Palestine 1947, an estimated 174,606 Jews lived in Palestine in 1931, and 474,000 in 1941. Why didn't Hitler accept Mufti's plea as one of the closest allies if he was committed to the racial destruction of the Jews, as most argue? Bonn-based journalist Rolf Vogel found that 270,000 Jewish people had emigrated from Germany between 1933 and 1942 with Hitler's direct approval. He further argued that Wannsee Conference was called to figure out how to get more Jews to emigrate. Apparently only 270,000 of the 500,000 Jews immigrated from National Socialist Germany. Another fact to note is that Herschel Grainspan allegedly assassinated Ernst von Roth on the 7th of November 1938 because his family was deported from Nazi Germany. One would think the family would have counted their blessings to have escaped alive. All this suggests that Hitler cared more about European Jews' welfare than did most Jewish leaders abroad, which is absolutely true. These Jews that start the wars, they don't care how many Jews get killed in the process. That really, it's just as long as they end up consolidating power. And by the end of it, and it was safer. You know, the Jews in the camps, the work camps. They weren't death camps. The Jews in work camps out in the country had a better chance of survival than a German citizen living in a city that was bombed by the Allies. Because there's certain groups of Marxists, who were ruling the world at the time, had, totally owned Churchill, All right, let's see. 179, 182. Okay, let's see what else is going on here. All right. Hitler on the goals of Zionism. He is instructed on war as a losing business proposition. Here I must point out Hitler interrupted that though its domination of the monetary system, Jewish power was always situated outside among other peoples, never within the borders of his own folk. This is a remarkable phenomenon. The power a person or a folk has abroad or in relation to the outside world is usually in inverse proportion to its own internal consolidation or its domestic power, unless we are speaking of a despotism based purely on military strength. The latter is, in my opinion, more powerful than financial might, but more dangerous, more easily attacked, and therefore vulnerable. The Jewish people, however, possessed practically no proper state organization after its deportation into Babylonian captivity. Domestically, there no longer existed any kind of power concentration, and on the military level, Jewry had never any significance. On the other hand, outside among other peoples, we see the Jews everywhere as traders, merchants, and bankers, and in the main as moneylenders, and when they control the money, they control the financial power. If Jewish power had been centered in a strong mother country, the enemies of Judah could have destroyed the state and its power. They actually did destroy the state when it existed. They even razed the temple. But the financial power every single Jewish possessed and wielded abroad was not touched by this act. And so this power went on nomandizing. There was no place where it could be touched, attacked, removed, for it had no vital center and did not lie in the area that was dominated by military ruling power. And by the way, the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD and so forth, that was God's doing. And I believe the return of Jewish people to Israel is God's doing. And but unlike most Christian Zionists, I don't therefore think that you can't say anything about the Jews, and the Jews can't do anything wrong. I mean, they are doing a great amount of evil in the world, and this is the kind of evil that's condemned in the Bible by the prophets. There are many places in the scriptures where the prophets are condemning the Jews for making the nations more evil. I mean, what do you see? Why do we have, drag queens doing story time for, school children? You know what I mean? Where do you think that comes from? All right. Therefore, it is also clear that Jewish financial power in the individual countries would, at one time or another, inevitably come in conflict with the relevant authorities, and that these states would seize the means either of locking up Jews or expelling them. But the nations never act in concert. On the contrary, most often a majority of the other states, usually under the very influence of Jewry, which was never miserly with its financial miserly with its financial resources and their effectiveness to accomplish this purpose, took a stand in opposition to the nation that had decided in favor of expulsion, and therefore such limited expulsions never broke the international power of Jewry. More often, they only served to strengthen. And exactly what happened by the end of World War II. And those nations that were, owned by the Marxists included United States and Great Britain. The financial power of Jewry can be broken only by the creation of a large Jewish state to which all the Jews are deported. And by the way, which is what Benjamin Netanyahu would like to see. And it's also prophesied in the Bible. But since such a project cannot be undertaken unless the people of the world, without exception, form into solid closed union, there is no need to hurry. And this is really interesting because it's going to happen in the Bible, and it's really morally the right thing to do. Now, what's morally wrong is to hate somebody because they're Jewish, or to try to destroy the Jewish race. Now, what will happen? So the part of expelling them is biblically and morally a correct thing to do. Now, but to try to kill them is incorrect, is immoral. Now, according to the scripture, what will happen is that's what's going to happen after the moral part takes place. The immoral part will take place, which will become the catalyst to bring the Jewish rulership to confess Christ, Jesus, as Messiah, and the beginning of a new era in human history. But it's coming. You can see it happening. You see it's coming. Okay. What I find particularly interesting in your presentation, I added, is that you say that, in fact, only military power can threaten Jewry, but only when Jewry lives together in a finite state. By the present time, efforts are underway precisely on the part of Jewry to create a new Jewish state, and the Jews' great hopes are focused on Palestine. The very fact shows you that Jews do not genuinely care about an actual Jewish state, for a cunning Jew would not situate his national home in a place that just happens to be a desert and where there is lack of all the raw materials necessary for a modern Volk. Therefore, the reestablishment of the Jewish state of Palestine has quite other motives. The Great War allowed Jewish power to increase quite incredibly. And that was World War I. That was the purpose of World War I. It takes money to conduct a war. And by the way, it also takes money to produce the propaganda to get people into the war. And so through the Great War, which in fact in some way united all people of the world, it shared suffering. In shared suffering, the Jews got the greatest chance they ever had. All the financing of the war, whatever nation was involved, went almost exclusively through the hands of the Jews. Read the signatures on the issuance of war loans. Not only German loans, but also English, French, American, whatever other countries. You will see the names of Jewish banking houses almost exclusively. They raised the money, and the good citizens scraped together their last pennies, signing them over to the consortium of Jew banks in the form of war loans. To those people who happened to have no cash at the moment, the banks even extended credit on tangible property so they could subscribe to war loans above their own real assets. Then the consortium of banks put the collected amounts at the disposal of the particular state in exchange for high agent commissions. Hundreds of billions of people's assets flowed through the coffers and ledgers of the Jew banks in this way, and each time hundreds of millions got stuck there in the form of commissions. The whole deal held no risk whatever for the banks. The banks added nothing from their own assets. Rather, as I said, they only loaned them to others against securities so that the others might be the fools to take the risk, or they used their liquid assets to carry out the financing of wartime economy, to which most of the loan funds flowed for war orders. The financial participation was at least as profitable and free of risk as the loan transaction. By the end of the war, in any case, the nations and the economy. Okay, excuse me a sec. I'm ready to launch the other video. You got to make sure that you launch these things in a certain amount of time, or they time out, and you got to start over. It's kind of a pain in the neck, you know. Okay. All right, and I'll come back to that in a minute. All right. Okay. Okay, I'm back. All right, here we go. All right. By the end of the war, in any case, the nations and the economy had, without exception, become the major debtors of the Jew banks, or were in their possession. Private citizens in large part held their war loans, which were either devalued or frozen, but the banks satisfied themselves with the securities. The financial power of the Jews was then consolidated as never before. The promise of the Old Testament seemed to have reached fulfillment. All nations shall be subject to you, their kings shall serve you, and so on. Jewish power in the world appeared to have become unassailable, absolute, and perfect. And there is amazing passages in Isaiah, for instance, that, I mean, that's exactly what's happening. The way it's described, it sounds like, God gave Isaiah, a global view of the world we're living today. Now, all that remained to be done was to prop up this power spiritually, politically, and as much as possible, even religiously. But this required a visible concentration of Jewish people. Where this center was situated was in itself of no consequence whatever, for it was not meant to be a proper political or economic power center. This power would have to continue to reside abroad among other nations. But we can see from this propaganda, for example, for the idea of the chosen people of Israel, the goal is being pursued. If one has seen the greasy, threadbare, scheming Polish and Galatian Jews as they come into Vienna and Berlin wearing their vermin-ridden kaftans and carrying bundles of soiled clothes, one can acquire a proper taste for God's chosen people. But the chosen people must connect with its old tradition. It has to go to Jerusalem. No other place in the world was as well suited and as significant. At the same time, Christianity, which also has its roots in Jerusalem, the site where the great Creator performed his works, was drawn into power circle of newly discovered people of God. It's interesting. I mean, you can see how biblically literate people were back then. I mean, there was just, they knew all these biblical passages and what was going on and so forth. And they refer to Jesus as the Creator, performing his works, right? The establishment of the Jewish state of Palestine is thus not the reunification of the Jewish people in one state, but the attempt to create a worldwide Jewish headquarters intended in time using international financial power to seize absolute control of the destinies of all people of the world. In order, furthermore, to eliminate any possibility of military display of power by any state, all that is required is the expansion of the League of Nations into a kind of world state. Then, if this world state might even be allowed to wield military might more or less as a world police, then Judah will finally have stabilized its financial power in the world, guaranteed and secured by universal international military force into which the oppressed are conscripted to serve the oppressor. That is the meaning of Palestine. Well, that is now, I think, they're going to end up with a false Messiah. There will be this. It's not going to end this way. I mean, this is evil, and it's going to end with Jesus destroying whatever is evil, and including whatever is evil in Judaism, in the world of Jews, as well as the world of Gentiles. I mean, all the evil will be destroyed. So this evil New World Order they're putting together is going to be, in a sense, co-opted by Jesus one day after great events take place. All right. Okay. This financial power would be broken once and for all by our idea of currency and ownership transfers. There is no doubt that world Jewry will make every effort to prevent its being put into practice, even its publication, I said. It follows then, as I have always stressed, that this idea may be in no way be made the subject of propaganda or even of a discussion outside of your most intimate working group. Anyway, it cannot be put into practice until we have seized political power, and even then not only the Jews but all of private industry, especially heavy industry, will oppose us, as well as the medium-sized large landowners and of course the banks. And how the army will react, the devil only knows. There's no one we can depend on except the middle class, the workers and the farmers. Granted, they constitute the mass of the folk, but we can carry out our plan only with the support of the intelligentsia, and they are the others. That is the dilemma we face. If we proceed with the masses against the intelligentsia, then, whether we wish it or not, our program will disintegrate into Bolshevik forms. But if we try our luck with the intelligentsia, the idea will be boycotted and sabotaged. So our only chance is to train a new generation in the socialist idea of responsibility for the community, of the folk, and in faith in the rightness of our direction and the aim and our aims. There's to be hope that the international Jewry, which is intent on leading all the peoples of the world in battle against us, grants us the time of one generation. Otherwise, we and the German folk will be cheated of our hopes and preparations, and Bolshevism will have its way, turning Europe into a field of rubble and setting the culture of the world back by centuries. For its control, too, lies in Jewish hands. Even if the Jews do not succeed in building their world dominion on financial power and securing it by international military might, they still use the method of Bolshevizing the world, removing the people's natural leadership class and enslaving the masses to secure the domination. No military power at all is needed. Sufficient for that is the Inquisition, currently called the GPU. Now, it's interesting because this is what's happening now. It's happening with cultural Marxism. This cultural Marxist control state dictates to all the major corporations cultural policy. Okay, Hitler found silent. We were somewhat confused, but once again his presentation had been so compelling and clear that it had drawn all of us completely under its spell. I therefore proposed a short recess of 5 minutes so that we might get back to the topic of the currency. Such discussions in Hitler's presence were always deep experiences, even for someone who was often in his company, but it was very difficult to make certain that the topic was adhered to. Time and again his genius rushed ahead of any logical sequence of thought, or he digressed on subjects more concerned with the political consequences of perception or deception than with the intended purely material consequences. Here I share your opinion completely, and Hitler interrupted. The state must try to figure out not everything it can organize and regulate through laws, but rather what it absolutely must organize and regulate. The state should be as invisible as possible. The economy is sure to find the right way by itself, and the education of people to morality and respect for the law, as well as to higher ethical relationship among one another and the community. These are the paths a state must take among a highly developed people which deserves freedom and trust, such as the German vote. All that sounds so simple and correct, Hitler commented. That it is hard to believe the world is actually caught up in a utopian delusion, is in the grip of what amounts to a hypnotic obsession. Occasionally, Herr Hitler, I replied, we may even become irresolute because it truly does seem quite unimaginable that humanity voluntarily surrender itself to a deception under which it suffers as under the lash. Marx, even Lenin and Stalin cannot be understood until one has recognized these things, Hitler offered. But is there really no other way out of the labyrinth of this delusion that originated in the Jewish exploit? I know you think you've found a way, and at the time it made sense to me too, but the subject is too foreign for me to be able to arrive at my own judgment. But that is precisely what makes the situation so bad, that the subject is too foreign to almost everyone, only this makes it possible to keep up the worldwide deception. But how did it happen that Marx and the Bolsheviks did not find a method other than total destruction when there must surely be a more reasonable course? Because men are so caught up in this hypnosis, Wagner replied, that they will not permit the necessary change unless it is forced on them by the most radical means, that is, by those of destruction. But you think that we can take another way? Once we have acquired 100% of the power in the state and the world, it will unite all the armies and navies of Europe and America to vanquish us and to remove this deadly peril to the world dominion of financial capital, that is, of Jewry. And they will kill anyone, they will burn all the books and documents that might serve as witness of the truth of the perception. Hitler fell silent. After a while he said, "And you believe that we would find no support even in England?" England and America are the ones most strongly interested in preserving that hypnosis. The only nation that might possibly be prepared to follow our thoughts is Russia. And I think at the time he meant the Russian people, because yeah, and that's really, I mean, so many of the Russian people were on the side of Germany because they suffered under, they see what the Marxist Bolshevik thing, how murderous it was. You know, we cannot go with Russia. The Russian isn't ready yet. He is clearly a compromised creature between child and beast of prey. The Russian folk wouldn't even begin to know what to do with our perceptions. If we find it hard going even with the German folk, how impossible would it be Russia? I'll admit that much. It will take generations before Russia is in a position to give its folk self-administration, not to mention entrusting it with organically establishing an economy. But you know, Putin's doing a pretty good job. And I think Trump's going to be, you know, another 4 years. But after Trump, I'm putting Putin in. Putin to 2024. I'm going to put a big sign up in front of my house. I'm delighted to hear you finally agreeing with me on that point. But now, Rentlin continued, then it is your opinion, Hitler asked, that no war can ever be won economically. A war on the dimensions of the Great War, never, Rentlin replied. And since new wars are always waged with new weapons, that is, with more expensive means of destruction, in future the disproportion will only grow greater. But if the victor seizes and expropriates for his own use all the land and all the factories and all the mineral resources of the vanquished, or at least a large part of them, it should be possible to obtain collateral for the war obligations. To some extent, yes, for if the state resells the confiscated assets, that is, those taken from the vanquished to private parties, it brings in money with which it can cover its obligations. It can even let itself be paid in war loans. But if instead of selling them, it nationalizes them, as it were, that imposes an additional financial commitment on the state. Of course, it can put the population of the conquered state to work, as was done in antiquity, in slavery, or in half wages. It can even sell them into slavery. Such procedures could absolutely be wrapped up in the cloak of Christian charity, for example, by allowing the workers among the vanquished, so long as they are prisoners of war, to work in private industry, while the employers pay the wages not to the workers themselves, but to the state treasury, giving the workers an amount sufficient only to keep them fit to work. That can be done. It isn't German, but after the Great War, some of the civilized nations behaved no differently. All the same, these are just drops of water in the sea of existing obligations and debts. Furthermore, in general, war causes such heavy devastation in the land of the vanquished, or at least in the areas where the war was fought, that the resumption of economic profitability in the country in question is delayed for years. If one keeps the land, it becomes merely one more burden. Therefore, in the last analysis, it drains the purses of the income of one's own citizens. If one doesn't keep it, one is saved the additional burden. True, but since international economic relations rest heavily on reciprocity, even the victor suffers from indisposition of the vanquished. Let me see, what page am I on? 185. Okay. 189. All right. Okay. 189. Okay, let's see. All right. If we consider am I on the right page? Yeah, 189. If we consider the question of why current governments do not tackle these projects, we can come up with three answers. One, they are deficient in the ideas, the understanding, the love of the Volk, and the will to do anything that runs counter to the previous interests. Two, the Volk lacks the faith, hope, trust, and courage needed for any undertaking, since it must fear that no good will come of anything. Three, the people who are in a position to place job orders lack the cash or the credit to carry out the work. So the problems are in an area quite different from industry of foreign exports or demand, faith, love, hope. These three form the ethical prerequisites, and the question of financing is the only practical consideration that must be solved beforehand. To solve the first three is the responsibility of the movement, the political leadership. We must solve the question of financing, subsequently must be implemented by the state. At this, Hitler rose abruptly from his chair, his eyes shining, and said, "Quite right, I share your view completely. People keep talking about how economic situation is to be changed and improved only by economic measures. No, there are two ways to alleviate hardship, perhaps even to abolish it, either by actually abolishing the hardship, but that is not always possible, at least not right away, or by abolishing the feeling of hardship, and that is possible if one goes about it the right way, to inspire faith, love, and hope. You're right, that is our first responsibility. It can be accomplished, or at least attacked, even before we can be active within the government. The greater the faith, the more trusting the love, the more conviction resides in the hope that unites us and our movement within the whole German Volk. The more powerful grows the readiness and the will and the whole dynamic with which we'll seize the government, then we need only give the right kind of support. The sense of having overcome will itself bring about the miracle of abolishing hardship. Kohler continued along these lines. I'm not worried about the psychological and ethical stipulations. The second point, the process of creating trust, creating new courage, and new confidence is already underway. Nor need there be any further concern about the first point. The ideas, the understanding, the love for the folk, the will of the leaders. Once we are in position to act, I shall return briefly to the details of the project later on. The big question mark applies to the third point, financing. This is what will be crucial. According to the prevailing economic theories, no avenue has been left unexplored. None of them has led to this objective. There simply is not enough money. Because of the lack of liquid assets, orders cannot be placed, and according to the current scholarly conceptions, and according to the principle thus incontestable of monetary fiscal policy, there's no way to create more money except at most through foreign credits. All right, let's see how much am I reading here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Only since I have belonged to the staff have I realized that the current theories of scientific economics are simply nonsense, and that the unassailable principles of internationally accepted monetary policies are just plain wrong. I've come to recognize that money is not a thing in itself, but a function of the industrial sector, and that a state has not only the right but also the duty to see to it that economic sector is sufficiently supplied with money, with good money. That's the kind of news I'd like to hear, but where does the money come from? It is created, Kohler answered, newly brought into being out of thin air, if you like, fabricated. Smiling, Hitler shook his head and said to me, if it were just him and me, I'd have to think the poor a crazy fool. To which I could only reply, and yet he's right. The only thing that's new about this idea is that the state is the originator. The Jewish banks have always done the same thing when they saw an advantage to themselves in it and found enough security. I do not understand that, he said, again, still shaking his head, which is why I continued. Pretend for a moment, Herr Hitler, that a plane flies over Germany and at intervals lets a 1,000-mark note flutter to the ground, where it is picked up by someone or the other. Let's pretend that a message is attached to each 1,000-mark note, saying that it is a gift from you or from the government, and that the finder may use it immediately, that he must use it immediately, that is, that he must buy something with it that he needs for himself and his family. What happens? Wherever such a 1,000-mark note is found and used as purchasing power, 1,000 marks are spent. Some people pocket these 1,000 marks as the profits of labor or goods, and the final outcome, somewhere and somehow work is created for about 1,000 marks. That means, taken all in all, one unemployed worker is put back to work for 6 to 8 months. But since he is in turn will be spending the 1,000 marks rather than hiding them under his mattress, a second unemployed worker is put back to work for about 6 months, or someone who has been working short hours can go full-time, or however you want to look at it, and demand for goods created by buying power of a new fully employed worker stimulates the production of these goods. One could perhaps say that every 1,000-mark note thrown from the plane put 2 to 3 workers in full employment for half a year. Okay, Hitler interrupted with a question. And by the way, that was a lot of money back then, right? That's a half a year's wages of that. You know. Okay, let's see here. Okay. But that's exactly what the present regime has been doing, after all. It pays unemployment benefits with no strings attached. Yes and no, and it goes on filling in the details. Apparently, okay. I'm going to skip ahead. Let me see. Do you consider it appropriate that it asked for us to publicize the idea presented here? So they came up with the money. No, we would rally the united opposition of the leaders who control the capital throughout the world and their governments. Even now, there are some who suspect that we are obsessed with jettisoning the gold standard and the idea of gold banking, a matter we already consider completely settled, so that we no longer discuss it. But that alone is enough to give the mighty in the roar heavy industry banking world, and especially the Masonic lodges, cause to sound alarm against our economic rivals. We will see that once we, as the strongest party in the Reichstag, can claim the right to form government, these people will manage to assign us to those ministries that have nothing to do with the economy, and especially to eliminate the influence, precisely those persons who gave birth to our socioeconomic ideas, who could realize it. Okay, let's see. 8, 192, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I am of the same opinion, Hitler remarked. So what I have always said about our economic projects and ideas applies to these matters too. They must not be leaked to the public. Strasser then asked, what shall we say in the Reichstag when we have to speak about job creation programs? I'll have to say something. If public statements are to be made, said Hitler, then it's appropriate that you talk over the matter beforehand with Wagner and agree with him about what can and should be said. In no case should the revolutionary monetary system we've discussed here today be mentioned. So I think what they were talking about is they came up with this idea of kind of like some kind of banknote anyways. Now I can anticipate taking over the government with calm and confidence if the hopes of the German Volk places in us are fulfilled by the facts in the way it seems to me was outlined here. The desperate hardship of this sorely tired folk will be replaced by a well-being and a firm faith that also form the basis for internal and cultural renewal. Then we will succeed in preventing the decline of the West. All right. I did not take the road of politics to smooth the way for international socialism, much less to preach a new socialist religion. I am not made to be the founder of a religion. This is Hitler speaking. I am not one to have no desire to be, and I have no desire to be one. Rather, I am a politician. I bring the German folk National Socialism, the political doctrine of the folk community, the solidarity of all who are part of the German folk and who are ready and willing to fill themselves an inextricable but considerable particle of the totality of the folk having responsibility for it. A folk in the current political sense has ceased to be a racial unit, a racially pure community. The great migration of world history, the military expeditions, the times of enemy occupation, and also, of course, the admixture that became ever more frequent as the result of international trade relations, has seen to it that all sorts of races and racial mixtures live side by side within the borders of any state. Nevertheless, most nations, the United States of America forming the most notable exception, are the structures within certain areas where either the old tribal system has survived, where a community has come into being over time that was consolidated into a folk, possessing its own style, its own language, its own attitudes on ethics and morality, its own culture. Such groups of people who feel that they belong together continue to unite under economic, political, and even purely geographic influences, and these groups rightly designate themselves as a people. And this same way, America will in time turn into one folk. And he was wrong about America. But as you can see, I mean, Hitler certainly was not this thing about a pure Aryan race thing, just is a fictitious slander. You won't see it. Hitler was actually pretty, multi-ethnic in his approach to things. I mean, he wasn't multi-ethnic in the way it's pushed now as it should be the norm, when it shouldn't be, really. I mean, ethnicities should, if they want to be multi-ethnic, it shouldn't be a forced, a compulsory kind of thing. That's wrong. That violates, it does violence to the human right, freedom of association. Let's see. All right. Let me see. 193. Am I reading that far? Let me bring my notes over here. All right, let's see here. Okay, 196, 3 and 4. The international element of the communist movement that emanates from Russia is not really Russian or Slavic. It is Jewish. And we must not make the mistake of believing that it is supported by a Russian Slavic idea, which might even have some creative content. The current activities of the Comintern members are purely destructive. There also exists a constructive international socialist idea, but it is altogether different. For look here, once nations have begun to carry out a socialist or socio-economic reorganization with their own borders, the time is ripe for the totality of nations, that is, all peoples and states, to give up fighting each other for power and supremacy, enslavement and exploitation according to liberal principles, that is, acting according to imperialist principles. Then, even among them, the time has come for giving pride of place to consideration, communal spirit, even socialism. What first occurred on a small scale within the individual nations will then take place among the worldwide community of nations. Even the smallest of them will enjoy equal rights. Even the have-nots will be able to share in the goods and the surplus of the elite's international property. That is socialism of the nations, but it is quite different from the international socialism of a Marx or a Lenin. If, for example, acting out of a higher discernment, industrial plants decide not to compete with each other, establishing instead a community of interest, each enterprise remains independent in itself. The only change is that each will be integrated into the totality according to a higher plan. taking into account considerations of production and market conditions and according to principles of reason and profitability. So each must give up something of its sovereignty in interest of the whole, but consequently also in its own best interest. It is equally true within a nation that each individual citizen must surrender something of his own sovereignty, what is colloquially spoken of as personal liberty, to organization of self-administration, the state. All rights originate primarily with the people. The Weimar Constitution understands this quite clearly. The Volk, each separate person, however, yields as much as necessary, but not more than necessary, to the state it has created or government it has established according to its constitution. Okay, 197. And that's really interesting because you probably didn't know that Hitler was was interested in this kind of globalist competitor for the Marxists. And it was the best thing was the fact that he was trying to get the Marxists out of Europe, and he should have succeeded. And too bad General Patton got murdered by our government. Because it's just obvious that's how they do things. It has nothing to do. That's why, on a national election, why do you vote? You're not a billionaire, right? They don't, what I mean? It's like people are, I don't want them to think I'm a fool. I really don't. They don't need the satisfaction of thinking they got another fool that believes in their system. All right, let's see here. I am at page 197, and I'm already going over an hour. I gotta stop it again. Okay, I think I can get this whole hour up on LBRY.